Okay, like Clara said, my name is Malin Mc Glinn, and I'm a PhD student at Urban Studies. And together with my PhD colleague, Claudia Fonseca, who unfortunately cannot be here today, she's stuck on a train, we planned these Urban Studies seminars, and we've had a program throughout the autumn. So this is our last seminar, and we decided to make it a part of this Urban Research Day. So that's why we're here. And quite early on in our planning process, we wanted to have today's speaker with us because of her, according to our opinion, very important, critical, and exciting research. So today's speaker is Dalia Mukhtar-Landgren. She's a PhD of political science from Lund University, and she will be talking about planning for progress and community. And the plan is that Dalia will speak for about 45 minutes, an hour, and then after that we will have some questions for about half an hour, and we will be ending off the session around about 2:15. And if you have any questions and you don't want to say them, you can just pass me a note and I will translate them and ask them. Otherwise, just raise your hand, and I'm sure we will be able to keep up with the questions. But for now, please welcome Dalia with a round of applause.
Thank you. Malin, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. I will be talking about my dissertation today. Sometimes I start talking a little bit too fast, so just wave if that happens, okay? And my point of departure in my dissertation work or my work with urban planning was approximately 10 years ago with the transformation of Malmö. And this is a quote that I stumbled upon from an information brochure from that time. It said, "Malmö has not initiated a change. Malmö is already a transformed city. It has happened before in the history of Malmö, but never in a shorter time. The contrasts are striking, both in our near memories and in what we can trace in the city environment. Visible contrasts tell a bright new story of the new Malmö." And as a political scientist, what interested me here was the potential or the possibility to completely replan a city, to change a city's identity from an industrial city to a post-industrial city or a knowledge city. And I asked myself, well, how is that possible? And why would we as citizens let anybody replan our city? So what I started thinking about in this endeavor then was what ideas legitimize and underlie this planning endeavor? So what makes the complete replanning of a city possible? Why do we as citizens, why do we buy into this? And legitimacy is, of course, a central concept in political science, and it concerns us giving away power, because we have power and autonomy, but to a certain extent, we give that power away. We let the state decide when we go to school, what we learn in school, how much money we earn, how many hours we should work, when we should be on vacation, etc. And we find this very plausible, and we don't mind doing this. We do this every day. But legitimacy is something that is contested, something that is debated and discussed, and that can also have different grounds. In planning, there has been a very strong faith in the rationality of the planner. So when we talk about legitimacy in a planning context, we generally think that it's legitimate that planners replan our cities because they are rational. We even have the conception that they are objective. They know what they are doing, and they are acting in everybody's best interest. But they are also democratically elected. So these are the two process values. We believe that planners are rational and that they have a democratic legitimacy. But there are also substantive values, and these are not discussed very much in planning theory. But this concerns what we think that planning can do for us. We generally believe that the state is legitimate, power is legitimate, if we believe that they can do something for us. And the question then arises, what do we think that planning can do for us, which makes it feel that it's okay to replan our city? And in my dissertation, I outline two different values, two positive values. The first value is the notion of community, that we are a city, that we are a union, and that we have some form of common interest in the city. Central to that notion is, of course, the stranger who does not belong to the city. So the duality then of the community and the stranger. The other notion is the notion of progress. There is an assumption that we can plan the city to become better than what the city is today. And today I will talk about progress primarily. I have chosen to focus on that concept. So before I describe how I will outline today's the speech I'm giving, I want just like to very briefly say something about where I got the idea of progress from. Campbell and Marshall state in their analysis of legitimacy in planning that planning is only defensible as an activity if it is believed that it will deliver a future that is better than which would result without. So if we don't plan, we will be worse off than if we plan. So planning will give us something better than what we have now, or that's what we have if we don't plan. In that sense, planning concerns the relationship with what we have today and what we want to have tomorrow. So this presupposes then that the future can be different, but also that we can improve it by design. So what I have done in my dissertation, or half my dissertation, which is on planning then, is to try then to analyze and discuss the importance and the meaning of the assumption of progress in planning. And why have I done this? Why this focus on concepts? These are two planning theorists, which are both prominent, if that is important. Friedman and Jean Hillier. Friedman states that practitioners, people working in the field with planning, constantly work with theoretical assumptions. And it is the theorist's job to make these assumptions visible and thus to help practitioners reflect on them. So this is something that was very important to me. Even though my dissertation could be accused for being quite theoretical, I still think that it's important to highlight the assumptions that we use as our point of departure in politics. Jean Hillier also takes it one step further and not only wants to show which assumptions we base our politics on, but also to problematize them. What are the effects of this assumption of progress in planning? So this is then what I have done in my dissertation and what I will be talking about today. So what I do then in half the dissertation is I do an analysis of the concept of progress in urban theory and how we understand the city, in planning theory and in planning practice, historically and contemporarily, but also in planning in Malmö. From the 1990s, the mid-1990s, with the start of visionary work until 2004. That's the time frame I had in my dissertation. So what meaning has the concept of progress had in these contexts? So today, I will start to talk a little bit about visionary work in planning. I will give you a definition of how I conceptualize or how I work with the concept of progress. Then I will talk about the importance of the concept of progress in the industrial city. Then I will move on to planning, the concept of progress in planning in Malmö and in Malmö, but also in a more theoretical sense. And then I will talk a little bit about my conclusions in the dissertation. And this will be very much on the topic of depoliticization. Okay, are you following me? Yes. I cannot see you because I have the bright light in my face, but I hope that you are happy and awake. Yes. I can do that. And I can think about what I will do myself. So. Okay, I hope you are done. So, visionary work in planning. Visionary work is extremely popular in public administration in general, and politics in general, but also very much so in planning. And when I talk about planning in this context, I will not only talk about the more traditional PBL planning, the planning that we think of in terms of city planning or urban planning in a more restricted sense. I talk about municipal development planning, which is a much broader concept, which is often situated under the Municipal Executive Committee's office in Swedish Kommunstyrelsen. That's why everything KS. And municipal development planning is a concept that is developed by the geographers Kristoffersson and Öhman, and that is used quite extensively in the Swedish context, where we have chosen not to use concepts such as urban regeneration or urban renewal, but instead want to use Swedish concepts that are more closely tied to the municipal political organization. And they describe municipal development planning as an ambition to gather municipalities' economic, cultural, political, and structural transformation in the form of an overall idea or vision. So this concept very much departs from... Am I louder than I was before? No, okay, just in my head. Anyways, this is very much departing from the transformation then from former industrial cities to post-industrial cities, and also something that has developed in the light of what we often refer to as urban crisis. And in light of these changes then, municipalities find a need or see the need to then try to gather themselves into a new vision for the future. And visionary work in planning has therefore not only been predominant in the Swedish context, but it's also something that's promoted very much by the European Union. And it's also very much in line with this, what we call new public management or neoliberal ideas on how we on political steering and on government, where we have made a transition from very strict and narrow instruments of steering to more overarching instruments, such as visioning in planning. So political steering in that sense is somewhat more vague. And how do these visions then appear? The strategic plans are often created in different forms of partnerships between civil servants, politicians, or different groups from the trade and industry, politicians and civil servants together. Many municipalities have not made these plans themselves. They have chosen a consultant firm to do it. And we have several Swedish consultant firms that make visions for the future. This was very popular during the 90s and the beginning of the 20s, but later it became somewhat unpopular. Many inhabitants were skeptical to these consult-made visions for the future. So now they are not so common anymore. We see more and more citizen participation in visioning. But during the mid-90s, it was very common that it was completely depoliticized in that sense. There are also ready-made visions that we can buy into. The European Union have visions. They have a vision called City Slow that Falköpings kommun is a part of. It's a package vision of the slow city, which is environmentally aware, but also has traditional values, etc. So that is another way of working with visions. And in Malmö, in the mid-90s, the city, as I'm sure you're all aware of, had an economic crisis. And after changes, and what is sometimes described as the Robin Hood system, where richer municipalities transfer funding to poorer municipalities, which is a tax equalizing system, Malmö municipality had the possibility to have a little bit more economic resources, and in light of these resources, but also in light of the crisis, the municipality initiated a visionary work called Malmö 2015, Malmö 2015. And Ilmar Reepalu initiated this work. He was head of the Municipal Executive Committee during this time, and a long time after that. And he states in a suggestion to the Municipal Executive Committee that in an age characterized by rapid changes and insecurities, it is important to create an image of how one wants the future to look. This can be done through the formulation of visions and suggestions for means to realize these visions. So a visionary work in light of this was then initiated. And this was organized in 8 thematic groups: economy, trade and industry, education, environment, culture, city planning, and social issues. And these groups consisted of civil servants from the municipality, representatives from trade and industry, and representatives from Lund University. No politicians participated in this work. So it was more or less expert groups. And the thought then, or the idea here were that these expert groups should formulate the visions for the new Malmö. And I will come back to the constitution of these groups and the implications of that later on. I just want to give you a picture then of how this was organized. So, moving on then to progress. Now you have the background. Are you following me? We have the visionary groups, we have the transition, we have the economic crisis. So now to the analysis of this material. Stomke defines progress then as the idea that mankind has slowly, gradually, and continuously advanced from the original condition of cultural deprivation to constantly higher levels of civilization, and that such advancement will, with only occasional setbacks, continue. So from this, I have found a couple of concepts that I then used to analyze all the material that originated from the visionary work, Malmö 2015, which is all the reports from these different groups, a couple of consultancy reports, and some other, a magazine that was produced, etc., some other material in this context. So progress is then seen as linear and cumulative, and not rarely in stages. Perhaps you have seen the image of the stages from the very primitive to higher and higher in terms of civilization. Progress is also then conceived as unavoidable. Progress always happens, and it's also irreversible. We cannot imagine that progress happens, and then we go back again. We will go back to the old industrial city, or why not to the rural Sweden? We can go back to that. But there is an ambivalence in terms of progress. And this is an ambivalence in the literature on progress, but also in how we understand progress in general. Is progress made by man or created intentionally? Do we create progress? Or is progress autodynamic or exogenous? Does progress just happen? Historically, there is very much an understanding that progress just happens. It's something that just happens by itself. It's not generated by people, it just happens to the city. And these concepts were then used in the analysis of the visionary work. So here we have the point of departure, a new era in Malmö. And here I have rather many quotes just to give you a feeling then of how progress was understood in this material. The old society is buried. We have seen entire industries disappear from Malmö. At the same time, a new society is taking form, smart, high-tech, and knowledge-based. Here we have also very much this autodynamic development. Everybody agreed that we were heading towards a new society. So this is not something that is contested or discussed. Are we heading towards a new society? What does this new society look at? No, everybody agreed. So these are from two different visions, the vision from the culture group and the vision from the environmental group. Here is a quote from a consultancy report. A new era arises that is separated from the previous one. So this is also this autodynamic, it has just arisen, and it's completely new. A new epoch is emerging as work-life politics, technology, and values are changing in a way that no one of us today has ever experienced. So everything has changed, more or less. Politics, work-life, technology, and value. Nobody has ever seen this before. It's not that someone has almost seen it. Nobody has ever seen anything like this. A complete transformation. And it has also arisen. One way of understanding this, and I thought about this ridiculously much for almost 1 year, and then I didn't write about it, so I would like to say it now. One way, or I mention it briefly, to understand this is in terms of a technological determinism, which is very much prevalent in the notion of progress, and is very much also visible in terms of the rise of information society. There is an image of the machine as the source of all social and economic transformation. We often describe how Gutenberg's printing press led to Reformation. We describe how the steam engine led to industrialism. What is also interesting here is that we often describe it as it's one man who invented something, and this invention in turn led to this complete transformation of society. What would happen if we didn't have Gutenberg? What would happen if we didn't have Newcomen? And I don't know if you're familiar with Manuel Castells, who has written about the informational city trilogy. He describes the rise of informational society in his book, and it is completely attributed to, I think, 20 men and their inventions, many of them in a garage. But it's a complete reduction then of the complete transformation of society to separate inventions by certain men. So this is something that one can bear in mind when thinking about how we talk about and how we understand these transformations in society. And we also have then the stages metaphor. And here we have an understanding of different ages and also different peoples. And this is very much visible in the Malmö material. I have chosen 2 quotes. The rural Malmö of the 1700s became the trade city Malmö of the 1800s and the industrial city of the 1900s. Today, in the 21st century, the city is becoming a service and knowledge city with 35,000 inhabitants. So here we have the development in stages from one step of civilization to the next. Again, it's just becoming. So this is something that's happening autodynamically. Another quote is the riksdaler became the krona, and now we have the euro, which we don't, obviously. But this is a vision for the future, so you have to bear with that. So again, we have something that is becoming something else, and we have the development in stages from one stage to another. So where does this then come from? Is it a coincidence that we see the city as the place where the new society is taking form? So to answer that question, I went back to urban history, read a lot of urban history, and I read the urban theorists of last century, very much the Chicago school of the 1910s, 1920s. Georg Simmel, Weber, Max Weber has written extensively, of course, about the city, and trying to see, well, how was this industrial city perceived? And we see very much the same image. Let me see what time it is. Yes. Yes, this is from Ernst Burgess. The outstanding fact of modern society is the growth of great cities. Nowhere else have the enormous changes which the machine industry has made in our social life. Here you see the technological determinism. Registered themselves with such obviousness as in the cities. In the United States, the transition from a rural to an urban civilization has taken place. So here we have the transformation, and we have the city as the place where these stages of civilization takes place. Robert Park, also from the Chicago School, the city is finally the natural habitat of civilized man. And this we recognize, of course, very much from the relation between the urban and the rural. But also, as I will talk about later, it's a colonial notion then of the Western city in relation to the rest. The beginning of what is distinctively modern in our civilization is best signaled by the growth of the great cities. So it is the cities then which is the site for these transformations. This was also in a great extent manifested in the urban landscape. This is something that you can read a lot about in Chicago and in Burnham's transformation of Chicago. But it was also manifested to the inhabitants of the city through different world fairs and exhibitions. And these exhibitions had the explicit aim to promote competition between municipalities and cities. Which city would become the most industrialized city in the world? But there was also the explicit ambition to show the inhabitants of the city what the future could look like. This is the future that you could all participate in if you just work hard enough. We also had flagships during this time, the Eiffel Tower of 1889, and this is Chicago 1893. And Chicago is often described as an urban laboratory for urban history and our understanding of the city with the Chicago School. And Chicago has also been very influential in how we understand the city and city development. So this ambition then to show off the municipality or show off the city, both to an external audience and to an internal audience, is something, of course, that we recognize today, but that's something that was very much predominant in the last century. This is also something that affects how we look at the inhabitants of the city. And I will come back to this in a discussion concerning who do we plan for? Who are we planning for? Who do we imagine when we plan? And who is the inhabitant of the city? Sorry. And here are some other quotes from the Chicago School concerning the city inhabitant. It is in the city that man developed philosophy and science and became not merely a rational, but a sophisticated animal. This is from George Simmel from the last century. He states that the urbanite reacts with his head instead of his heart. Metropolitan life, thus, underlies a heightened awareness and predominance of intelligence in metropolitan man. So the metropolitan man or the urbanite is the epitome of civilization. You can also note that it is a constant use of the male subject here. It is the metropolitan man that is on the absolute top of civilization. Here's another quote, and I chose this quote in relation to the stranger, which I talk more about when I talk in my the part of the dissertation which is on community, but just to show how the image of civilization and what is associated with progress and the city is very much created in relation to the other. It is in the urban environment, in a world that man himself has made, that mankind first achieved an intellectual life and acquired those characteristics which most distinguish him from lower animals and from primitive man. So this understanding of the city in the West and the city and civilization is very much built on a colonial discourse and understanding. And it is also related to an idea that was very popular during this time, which was the notion of humanity. And there was an idea then that all human beings were on one line of civilization. We were one humanity. And that they were all developing. But some were more developed than others. Some were very long, had gone very long in this development, and some were unfortunately stuck. And this is also very much illustrated in the World Fairs. This is an article from 1904, an anthropologist who tries to encourage other anthropologists to come to the Louisiana Purchase exhibition as part of their studies. Here the ambition was then to bring to the exposition the largest assemble of the world's peoples and the world's history. Some of the alien groups have been selected especially to represent ethnic groups, and nearly all the groups have been selected with special reference to culture grade, so that every known stage of industrial and social development is typified among the peoples on the exposition grounds. And this was very common in world exhibitions. On the one hand, we had all the marvels of industrial society. On the other hand, there were chronological exhibitions of different peoples or different stages of society. And this was also in a way to try to exhibit to the people living in the city, who were often relatively bad off, to say that, well, you can also come to this next step of civilization. We have been here, we are heading to this. This is the next step. So it's obviously a very racist way of understanding urban civilization. Obviously, this is not the only way of understanding the city. There was also a counter-discourse during this time. Even though this counter-discourse was not very strong, it still existed, and it has also always been in a nuance or a balance against the idea of progress. There has always been an understanding that cities should either be preserved or maintained, that there should be an understanding of nature and the balance of nature, and on the other hand, then, the ambition then to substitute, to replace the city we have with a new city. So both these discourses, or both these ways of understanding the city, has, of course, always existed, but the notion of substitution and progress has always been dominating. Lewis Mumford was one of the critics to and there are many others with him, of this idea of progress. He described progress in an article from 28 as the deadest of dead ideas. It was very critical to the notion of progress, and he states that, in short, we have had the alternative of humanizing the industrial city or dehumanizing the population. So far, we have dehumanized the population. And this is also an understanding that comes from the great inequalities that we see in cities, and that we didn't, to the same extent, see in these understandings of the urban civilization. Of course, these cities were impoverished. There were huge differences between different groups in society. And this is something that was, to a relatively small extent then, illustrated in these understandings of urban civilization. But it was, of course, very much in urban studies at large. So, moving then from this understanding to the city to the planning of the city. The question here is, of course, are these changes, are these steps of civilization something that we have generated ourselves, or is this something that has just happened to us? And this, of course, affects what we can do in terms of planning. So has it been generated, created, or has it happened to the city? Koselleck, who has written extensively about the idea of progress, concludes that there is a tendency, when we talk about progress, to see progress as a supranational subject of action. This is also something that I think that was very well illustrated by the initial quotes from Malmö, that progress is something that just happens. It's something that becomes. And there is a notion that this comes from progress. For Koselleck, this means, and he doesn't talk specifically about planning, he just mentions it very briefly, that this way of understanding development in city means that progress in itself produces a necessity for planning. So these changes, these stages of civilization are not something that we have created. It's something that has happened, and it has made it necessary for us to plan. So how have we seen this in Malmö? Is it the municipality in the city that has generated this progress? Or is it up to the municipality to handle the progress that has already happened? Talking in a more general sense, the idea of handling progress has been very influential in our understanding of planning during the last century. Friedrich Engels, when he came to Manchester, stated that this city is less built according to plan than any other city. And this is, of course, the image of the industrial city as a complete chaos. Peter Hall also has this understanding, and it's very much in a Marxist way of understanding how the emergence of planning. In practice, the planning of cities merges almost imperceptibly into the problems of cities. So we have problems in cities, and planning comes and somehow handles these problems. Where some Marxists have said that, well, we should just stop handling the problems, and this capitalist system will collapse. In relation to this, we have another understanding of planning, which is the planning of the rationality of knowledge and of technology. Leonie Sandercock describes the rise of planning as presented as a heroic progressive narrative, part of the rise of liberal democracy, with its beliefs in progress through science and technology, and faith that rational planning and ideal social orders can achieve equality, liberty, and justice. This is very much a Swedish way of looking at planning. There was very much an ambition and a belief that we could plan the ideal society. We can plan away crime, we can plan away danger and poverty, we can even plan away unhappiness. Everything can be planned away through a rational and objective planning instrument. Michel Gunder talks about this also very much as the notion of modernity and planning. Man is no longer part of the larger world. Man is above nature, and it is ours to control with the instrument of reason. So on a rational base, we can completely replan cities. So how does it look in Malmö then? How do we plan for progress? These are two quotes from the vision from the trade and industry. Historical leaps develops the city. Now in the 21st century, Malmö is facing its next leap. Again here, this is the vision from trade and industry, näringslivet. There is no image here that it is the municipality that is generating any changes here. These changes has just happened to us. We have to adapt to them. So in the Malmö material, the notion is very much that planning can generate progress, but the definition of what this progress consists of is already decided. We already know we are in this new knowledge-based, technological, post-industrial society. So the visionary work was paradoxical in the way that they didn't discuss what visions of the future we should have. They rather state that we all agree that these are the visions that are already here. We are talking about how we can reach these visions. So it was a visionary work where the visions were already decided, and they were decided by the progress of the autodynamic. So there was no discussion of content in that regard, and the written processes. This is also something that can be explicitly seen in the material. Globalization also determines the scope for an independent municipal politics in Malmö. So it's globalization that decides what we can do. How do we attract more business? So again, the content of policies was already there, and the question was then, how do we adapt to this? And here we have the image and the vision of the municipal development planning that I think that we all recognize. A successful city attracts investments and new companies. It attracts new inhabitants. There is not a discussion here on what the successful city is, what one could perhaps expect from a visionary work. No, it just states that this is what we have, this is what we need to do in order to fulfill this. Malmö has talented entrepreneurs in the entertainment industry. With the right signals and right stimuli, these could be persuaded to stay and work in the city, and thereby create a rich variety of small and creative businesses and this exciting industry of the future. Here, we again have the notion of this is what these are the inhabitants that we need in order to fulfill this new image of the future and the new progress that we are standing before and that we need to adapt to in order to reach it. So the conclusion one can draw here is, of course, the question, okay, well, who are we planning for then? If we don't have visions for the future as an open, contested debate, what is it then that we are aiming for? And this is something that is obviously central when we talk about visionary work. Because visionary planning strives in essence for something else, especially if we are all agreed that the industrial society is gone and that it's not going to come back again. In visionary planning, Arnsberg and Bergström, two urban theorists, state, there's often a gap between how people are and how they should be. There is a hope of a new kind of inhabitant that is somehow better than the current inhabitants of the city. And this is very much true if we think that we are going from one stage of civilization to the next stage. Well, the old people who were in this old stage of civilization, that's not the people that we are planning for here. We are planning for the ones on the next stage, the ones that we want to get here, or the ones that we want to keep through different stimuli and the right signals to stay and to work in the city. So the question then is, are we then planning for the people who live in the city, or are we planning for the ones that we wished perhaps could live there instead of the ones that are living here? And this is very much something that we think of in terms of the creative class. I mean, who is this future inhabitant? Who is the new Gutenberg? Who will invent the new steam engine or the computer chip? Well, it is the creative class, and we have to plan cities not for the people who live here, but the people that we hope will come here and invent the steam engine and lead us on to the next step of civilization. So there are two different aspects here, as I see it, in the politicization of this visionary work. And I describe the visionary work in my dissertation as something that was, to a large extent, depoliticized. And there are two different aspects to this. The first aspect is what we describe as arena shifting. And this is something I mentioned initially, and something that we generally talk about in public administration today. That is that public decision-making is moving from the executive municipal committee or from the traditional political sphere to different forms of governance, partnerships, private actors of different sense, but also to very informal groups consisting of experts of different kinds, consultants, etc. And this is described sometimes as arena shifting. So we see a depoliticization or moving these ideas or the visionary work away from the political, in the organization of Malmö 2015 in these 8 different expert groups consisting of civil servants and members from the trade and industry and the university. So the actors that are included and the way that they were organized. This was also something that was criticized by the politicians when the visionary work was presented to them. These are 2 answers or responses to the visionary work. One from the left party that states, the left party does not mind long-term thinking, but we are critical to the mission's design as well as the way that it was done. This referring then to the visionary work. It is not likely that something innovative will come when civil servants are talking among themselves. And also Folkpartiet, the Liberal Party, states, I think that there must be several different visions of our future Malmö, liberal, socialist, and conservative. Therefore, I believe that the project Vision 2015 should be shut down. Political parties should not escape our responsibility to formulate visions of the future Malmö. So there was a debate and a critique that the visionary work was to a very large extent depoliticized by moving it out from the decision-making bodies. One should remember that this is not something that we should just accuse Malmö for, and this is not something that is in any way unique for the visionary work in this municipality. This is something that is very much consistent with how we think of urban brand management or urban branding in general, where there is an understanding that these are not political questions, and they should not be political questions. This is from a consultant, Bengt Håkansson, that is often referred to in these contexts. Urban brand management must at all costs be depoliticized. In order for the efforts to be lasting and credible and give the desired effect, consensus across party lines must be advised. So if we have a conflictual political atmosphere, like the atmosphere was in Malmö during the mid-90s, it is best to leave the politicians out of it. We do not want conflicts when talking about visions. We want consensus. And this is also something that's very much part of the communicative turn in planning for the ones of you who are interested in planning theory, where we also have a strive for consensus to a large extent. So this is something that we also see in planning theory. There's also another part of the depoliticization, which I think is worse to some extent because it is not open, it's not visible to us. That the construction of a visionary work where the visions were already decided by the progress. Instead of stating that these are the visions that we will have, this is the social democratic visions of Malmö, or this is the visions that we propose for Malmö, the visions were not explicitly stated as already decided, but it was very implicit in all the work of the visionary groups, in the material that was presented. And also the notion that progress has happened to the city. There is no one to blame here. There is no accountability. There is no way to change this, and there is no other option, because this has just happened to us. We have no other alternative than to adopt. Well, of course we have to build Bo Nollet. This has happened. We need these people to come here. Where are they going to live? They need their nice houses. This is just an adaptation. This is not something that we have chosen. This is not different alternatives that we have discussed. So in summary then, depoliticization in terms of the visionary work in Malmö has 2 different aspects. On one hand was the organization of the visionary work, which I have described as arena shifting. But also then, depoliticization in the terms of conflict, contestation, which we obviously associate visionary work with. And then the move then to consensus. In political theory, this is sometimes described as the post-political condition. So why then, to summarize, is this problematic? Why is depoliticization problematic? Isn't it wonderful if we can all agree and have consensus? Well, arena shifting obviously is problematic because political issues should, in an ideal sense, and in all possible definitions of democracy, be placed within a political decision-making arena together with a discussion on different alternatives. Alternatives must always be visible. Why? Because alternatives open up for critique, for discussion, and for contestation and debate. We have to have different options when talking about visions of the future. Obviously, also in terms of accountability. If it's not politicians that are responsible for the decisions that are taken, we have no possibility for accountability. Accountability means that if I give my power away to someone, I have the possibility to take it back. If I don't like what you're doing with my power, I want it back from you. And in politics, ideally, this is possible. We vote for politicians, they have our power. We don't like them, we take it back. If it's not politicians who have our power, we cannot take it back from them. They have it, and we can't do anything about it. We can't even critique it. The other problem is why we need visible power struggles. And I think that this is extremely important today when we talk so much about dialogue and consensus. And there's this idea that through planning we can reach an understanding of the common good that we can all agree on, and that this is something that we should see as possible. For me, this is something that is suspicious because consensus hides power. We do not see who is the winner and who is the loser here because everybody wins. We don't see the struggle. How did this consensus win over other forms of consensus? Slavoj Žižek, who's a political theorist, argues that contestation, conflict, makes it possible for excluded groups to protest against the injustices that they have been subjected to. If we do not see who has the power and who has lost the power, the people who have lost the power don't have a place to critique from. Without visible conflicts, this is from Chantal Mouffe, the potential for legitimate opposition within the democratic public sphere is circumscribed. So are you against Malmö becoming a knowledge society? That's crazy. How can you be against that? There is no position you can take within the political sphere where you can argue for that without seeming almost a little bit crazy. Are you against development? You can't be against that. We have no choice here. So there is no position, no place where you can stand to critique the development. Depoliticization also then makes it difficult for excluded and or critical groups to articulate a political critique. It takes away the platform that they can stand on. So just then to finalize on the necessary politicization of visions of the future, Campbell and Marshall, that I quoted initially, said that we would argue that in the final analysis, planning is judged by its outcomes. It is only defensible as an activity if it is believed that it will deliver a future that is better than that which would result without. This is the quote I had initially. And then they add, what is better must confront substantive but contestable issues concerning what is good. So this depoliticization, as I describe it and understand it, has the double then parts of, on the one hand, this is part of the notion of progress in planning theory. This is how we understand development in planning theory. This is an assumption we have in planning that progress happens to cities and we handle it. This is something that planning theorists and planning practitioners, we agree on this. On the other hand, we have a neoliberal urban development where decision-making in planning is shifting from the very formal political decision-making processes to different forms of partnerships. Private actors are gaining more influence, and we also see different types of private-public partnerships, what I have described then as arena shifting. What I would then like to see would be a much stronger forum or a place for debate where the ambition was not perhaps consensus, but rather than to show contestation by showing, okay, who are the winners and who are the losers in this planning process, and give critiques and people who are not winning out in these processes a platform from which they can formulate the critique that they have. Yes, thank you. How is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Dalia. I'm one of these crazy people that I'm accused of not being for development. So I got a lot out of your presentation. I'm not going to take up so much time, I think, because there might be other questions, and we can speak afterwards. But just kind of tying in this morning with today, we were talking about culture, and I think some of our Danish scholars and others also raised the question who we're planning for, that you very much bring up as well. And for me, I'm not a planner, but I just want to put it on the table that it seems to me that we're very much planning for the consumer, the planning of the consumer of art, and there were questions raised this morning about maybe the ambivalence of being an artist and having to maybe conform to the what you call the kind of neoliberal development agenda. Now we're here, it's inevitable, we can't take it away, so just let's run with it. So planning for the consumer, and this inevitable kind of there's no way going back kind of narrative that's being constructed, I think, through the the discourse of telling the story about Malmö, as on the one hand we're here and we can't take it back. So I find that very interesting. So I have some questions, but I think that maybe other people have questions. I can't see, so no one has anything. We have one question here.
Hi, Jon Högman, student here at Malmö Högskola. Thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, if the official political arena, as it looks today, somewhat moves towards a consensus and a mutual agreement between the different political sides, is it a problem if the arena shifting towards maybe interest groups, focus groups, and that arena in that case becomes political? You see a lot of, for example, with the sellout of the commons in Botkyrka, where the civil groups joined up to face the politicians in a political fight against the selling of the commons. Is it a problem with arena shifting in that point of view?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that much of the arena shifting is very much an explicit or one. We want to. There is an understanding that politics is not very efficient. That politics is like small stones in the machinery, and where politics comes in, things almost die, or they at least become very much slower. So we have tried in different ways to try to make policies and politics more efficient by moving them away from politics. This is very much the idea of the European Union. They want to see this to a very large extent, to try to inform policies in different ways by adding more actors to it, and often actors who have money in one sense or another, because they are the people that will actually do something. And in that context, there has also been a rise in what is called citizen dialogues, different policies to try to increase democratic participation. And when you are critical to these forms of policies, you often get the answer, well, why don't you like the citizens? I mean, citizen participation is wonderful, and isn't it good that we see groups of people that from below are initiating policies or changes in different forms of citizen groups? And obviously, democratic participation is always something that is positive. And whether or not this should be organized within the frame of the state is something that I think is, which you are pointing to, I think is one of the most important challenges for democratic theory today, because we see more and more of these types of changes, and we are increasingly positive to them. What we can say from a critical point of view is, well, who participates in these citizen channels? I mean, who has the possibility to organize in that sense, both in terms of class, gender, ethnicity, etc. I like the state in the sense that, well, political representation is at least formally equal. There is at least a potential for that. But obviously, it's difficult to be critical against protests, which this is. So I think that I can't give you a better answer, but I think that the question you pose is one of the more important questions that we are raising today. It also ties into very much the question of what's it called, sustainable development, where there is a consensus that politics can't solve this. So it has to be solved in other ways, through other groups, through other channels. And that we think that it's almost okay if we are a little bit undemocratic, because sustainable development is so important that it doesn't really matter how the decision-making processes are organized. And that, I think, is a slippery slope. But I think that's an excellent question.
So there's, a democratic deficit, if you like, to be filled. And, it seems like we're at a stage where we fill that kind of. We don't really mind it because the goal is more important. The sustainable goal is more important than how we get there.
Yes.
One reflection I had when you were talking, I would love to turn this into a Foucault seminar, but I'm not going to do that. And also what I've reflected upon, and maybe you can reflect upon also, is that these kind of spaces of appearance that Hannah Arendt spoke of, a space where different conflict can appear, people can talk to each other. It seems like they've been disciplined into what we call mötesplatser. So we plan for mötesplatser because we don't want political riots to appear anywhere. This is something that I've thought about. But I think we have a question. So
yes, I want to. Hello.
Hello.
I liked your story here. So I want to know this thinking you were talking about that the political life is so. I don't remember the word efficient. What did you say?
Inefficient, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that's a true story, or is it like a song for Eurovision Song Contest?
No, I don't. It's if we look at how this has developed, we had there was a crisis in the trust in politics during the 80s, where we felt that politics is not very efficient. We had this image of Sweden as an enormous bureaucracy, which moved very, very slowly, and we thought that okay. Politics are slow, companies are efficient. So we will borrow ideas from companies and put them into politics, and politics will also be efficient. So this is called new public management, and this is something that is very, very much an idea that comes from both left and right, our social democrat and right. And it's a truth. It's a neoliberal truth. This is something that I think that there is a consensus in relation to that. We also talk about that in the housing crisis. Why are we not building in Sweden? Well, there's too much politics. If we just take away politics, we will build for everybody. So that is the notion. I don't think that there is any empirical evidence or indication that the state cannot organize politics in an efficient way. What the state has a problem with is that the state doesn't primarily strive for economic profit. The state also has to take equality into consideration. They have to take justice into consideration. We have to take democratic participation into consideration. We have all these other values that are important for the state and that the state have to uphold. When a private actor produces a service, they don't have to take this into consideration. They only have to take their stakeholders into consideration. It is profit that is there. So there are more. It is more multifaceted to try to evaluate if the state is efficient or not. You could very well say, well, if the state provides houses to many different groups in society, that is efficient. Whether or not the houses cost more, a lot or a little to produce. So it depends also how you define efficiency. And because we have a definition of society where efficiency is very much economic efficiency, the state becomes the inefficient part. But you could also open up for other ways of understanding efficiency in terms of equality. But I think that it is a truth that is very difficult to reverse.
Maybe on that note, I thought of it, and maybe it's something that I'm missing. Wouldn't be the first time. But when the state has the responsibility, like you were saying, the state has to take in, democracy, legitimacy, justice, and so on. And I was reflecting this morning when I didn't know that within this area of Norra Sorgenfri that there were 38 different owners of the buildings of the land, and so I can understand from you know, if you play the devil's advocate, if we're in that stage now, you know, where we have to engage in order to turn into to these things that were discussed this morning, then we have to engage with obviously the 38, you know. But I can't. I just think, like, how did we end up here in the first place? You know, because like now when we're here, it seems obviously inevitable that we have to engage with, you know, näringslivet. But you know, I would like to go back. I don't know how that has happened. That, you know, the land has been sold out. So I don't know. That wasn't a question. That was just a personal reflection.
Yeah. Good.
A very long one. I would, if there are no questions, I would like to you know, you touched upon this in your presentation also, but I've read your dissertation, and you speak of the stranger. In my dissertation, I speak of othering, or creating the other through policy. Who is the stranger? In your, like, when you see the stranger, like who is this individual?
That's a very difficult question, Malin.
I just you know, sat here and spoke you know, out loud without having anything to say, so you're free to do the same.
No, but I think, God, what I think is so fascinating when we talk about the stranger in the city is that the city, in essence, is a meeting place for strangers. When Aristotle described the city, he has this, I'm sure you've seen this symbol with the cross and a circle around it. And that's strangers meeting and settling down.
Right.
And this is why we like the city, because we are all strangers to each other in one sense. Simmel wrote a lot about this, that we are the cities, and that's what also makes us intelligent, because we have so many impressions all the time, according to Simmel, that we have to try to sort out these, and this gives us a heightened awareness. In the countryside, they don't have that problem, because they already know each other. So this is the stranger. But what Simmel also states are that some people are strangers than other people. So we are all strangers to each other in one way, but some strangers are more stranger than other strangers. And they are strangers in that they are a different type of person, a strange type of person, a person that doesn't really belong in a place where everyone is strangers, which is so paradoxical, because we are in this, that is the essence of urbanity, is that we are all strangers to each other, but there is a limit of how strange you can be and still be a part of the city. And that limit today is, you know, just refugees, immigrants. I mean, it's which is so, you know, in itself also from a historical perspective, so paradoxical. But I think that's where the limit lies. And this is also something that we have seen in throughout urban history, this fear of the stranger. Weber talked very much about this and about the walls that we have to raise around our cities to protect them. And there's also Rousseau. You know Rousseau, Jean-Jacques. He is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He talked a lot about the common good, which is a central notion for planning. There is an idea that's of an objective common good for the city. And he hated cities, Rousseau, because there were so many strangers there. He said, in a place with many strangers, we can never have a common good. There is a homogeneity prerequisite. In order to talk about the common good, we all have to be more or less the same. And this has also been something that has been characterizing urban planning, that it's problematic for planners to handle too many strangers. I mean, many planners or many urbanites love cities because there are so many strangers, but not too much of the strange. Again, there is this limit that we have to handle.
So like, you know, diversity or strangeness becomes kind of the fuel for planning, but then it can be too problematic if it's too diverse.
Exactly, and that's that balance is extremely difficult in some ways. And in other ways, you can just make an empirical analysis and you can very easily see, okay, who are these groups of strangers?
Well, this is what I do. I just wanted to push you a bit with the stranger, because Simmel, I think, my teacher can tell me otherwise, but Simmel also talks about the blasé kind of attitude in the city. that, you know, because there's we don't know people, we don't live on the, you know, we're not in the countryside where we say hello to everyone. It also creates a sense of blaseness that we, you know, we don't really engage because, well, maybe we're afraid to, I don't know, or we have this kind of watered down kind of attitude or encounter with strangers or others.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's what said, another urban scholar, Tönnies, talked about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. He talked a lot about that this blasé attitude, that was really the problem of cities. And there are also, I mean, Leonie Sandercock argues that many urban planners have, in fact, tried very much to recreate the sense of community that was lost with urbanization.
Yeah.
So, and that, I mean, you can ask anyone who lives in a city. Some people, they love to talk with their neighbors, and others are like, no.
Yeah.
I live in a city because I don't want to talk to my neighbors. I don't even want to see them when I do my laundry.
That's why we have this teeth hole in our...
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is this complex, it is both extremely urban, the stranger, but it is also something we want to keep out of the city.
Yes. We have a question up here.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question on very much the theme you're now entering. When you talk about how there might be levels to strangeness or something, you could imagine that in a smaller scale you'll have more in common within the smaller community or the neighborhood or something. But how then would you discuss depoliticization within a neighborhood or something where there really are no political structures? Do you see what I mean?
No, I'm sorry, I don't see what you mean. I'm sure you mean something very good, because I think I can see that yours. Yes, I understand the neighborhood that you are moving in, but I don't really understand what you mean.
No, but basically, when you discussed strangers and like there might be some limit to how strange things can be, I started thinking about the smaller scale, the neighborhoods or something, and you started talking about it later on. But then in relation to your thesis and depoliticization. When you go down in scale, there are really no politics. But can you then discuss the depoliticization of space on the smaller scales?
No, I think that there's also politics there. But I must say, in relation to the stranger, I was actually quite positive to how Malmö municipality worked in integration policies, in the sense that they were very much politicized. That was a debate where it was very clear who were the winners and who were the losers, and which groups were the problems and which groups were the solution to the problems. And so that question, I think, in Malmö is not so depoliticized. I think it's quite politicized. I think that there are many platforms for groups who are marginalized to actually raise a critique. I think that in relation to Jon's question before, that there are these types of initiatives and that there are spaces for them. So I see that issue both in history, I mean, talking about different ways of seeing the stranger, that is a highly politicized question in planning, and in planning history and in the image of the urban. So it is more politicized. So I think you are right in your question on what happened to depoliticization. I think it is more politicized, those questions. I don't think depoliticization is a general change, which we often see it described that way in planning. I don't think that that's true. I think that there are certain issues within planning that are extremely politicized and very highly contested. The adaptation to the new society is not one of them. But I think what you are mentioning here, integration policies, etc., that they are to a much larger extent politicized.
We've got questions up here.
Okay, hey.
Hey, Per.
Hey, Dalia. Tack.
Thank you.
First of all, we might add one more of the old men thinkers, Karl Marx, who wrote about urbanization as the way out of the rural idiocy. But that was not my question about. I was just thinking that when we go back and see what the work was carried out in Malmö during the 90s, it's quite clear that the main objective for everything is economic growth. And I think that Mr. Reepalu himself said very explicitly that we are building now for the high-income segments of society. And the whole idea of the trickle-down economy and so on. But now we have another story being told about sustainability. And I would just like you to reflect upon whether we can actually detect a shift from one thing to another. Are we entering a more awareness of social issues, of justice and welfare and so on? Or is it rather that the idea of economic growth has become so naturalized, so it's taken for granted, and now we can look upon sustainability as well?
Yeah, two good questions. No, one, yes, a good question. Just to go back to Ilmar Reepalu and the ambition for growth, I interviewed many civil servants, and my overall impression was that there was really the absolute best of intentions in terms of equality from the municipality. I remember one civil servant, he said, "But Dalia, why do you think we do this circus? It's just so, we just want to get back on track again." And I really got that. I mean, there has been so much criticism against trickle-down policies, and we know that perhaps it doesn't work to the extent that we had hoped for, etc. And we can be very critical towards that. But I really think that in terms of intention, I think that they were there in Malmö during the mid-90s. I think that there was also an intention of economic redistribution in Malmö during that is. I really think that is the case. Then that hasn't happened, and how can we understand that hasn't happened? I think that's also very important to discuss, and we have to discuss the consequences, etc. But just a parenthesis to that. But I finished the time frame was 2004 in my dissertation, which was also partly because I didn't want to have that discussion on sustainable development. I think that part, the idea of sustainability, going back to Mumford and humanizing the city, that has always been there as a counter debate. It's very clear in humanities and arts, etc., that we have always had the romanticism contra the rationality, etc., and that has always been both these two have existed in a parallel way. Whether or not we can see sustainable development as something that it balances the aim for economic growth, or if it's just part of this aim for economic growth, I can't answer that question. I would say that this is something that historically is not surprising or strange in any way, and that is something that has very much characterized planning always. But whether or not the progress lovers have hijacked the environment or not, I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that. Probably some have and some haven't. Probably it's that complex.
We have another question up here.
My name is Christer Persson, and
yes.
Hi Dalia.
Hey, who has helped me so much with my dissertation.
So we have met
yes.
several times before, and I risk to introduce myself like this. I was the project manager of the Visionary project, so
yes.
I was really into it. And
I was terrified when I saw you here.
Yeah, I know. But I think it was an excellent presentation, and you're onto some very interesting aspects of the work, of course. What I was thinking about, and I could, of course, talk a lot about this and many of the things that you have been talking about. But one thing that I was thinking about is, and this is my question to you, would there be any difference to the organization or the process of the visionary work if it wouldn't have been in a crisis situation? If it had been a much calmer situation where we were looking forward to a new Malmö, but without this crisis on our back?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I've been thinking very much about why the municipality chose this organization. And I think that there are several different aspects here. One aspect was that it was a very high level of conflict, as I understood it, in the municipality during this time. And there was a will to step away from these conflicts and try to find something that could unite. And there was also, as you were saying, this crisis situation. So I definitely think that, and I think we see that, because Malmö was one of the first municipalities to work with visions in that sense. And I also know that many from the municipality were visiting other municipalities and talking about the visionary work. Many copied Malmö's model. recently, if we look at visionary work today, they don't work that way. It's much more citizen participation. And perhaps that is one of the reasons, that not only that in light of the criticism, but also that I think Malmö was almost in a shock state there, both in terms of the organization with the linje organization, I mean that we had that the different parts of administration were so separated from each other in a way which they are not in many municipalities today, but also the very high level of conflict between the different political parties, and also within public administration. So I think that I think in Malmö today, and when Malmö has done similar things today, which have been organized in other ways, it would have been organized somewhat differently. But still, I think that Malmö in the mid-90s was very much in part of a general vision of public administration in terms of new public management and new, more efficient ways of organizing decision-making, etc. So Malmö is very much, I think, a child of that age. But I think Malmö, both with its consensus tradition and with a high level of conflict, that could explain or help us understand the organization of the visionary work. But I still think it was problematic. But I think that could explain why it was so.
We have one more question, or we have two more. No, two more questions, and then we will have to sum it up, I think. So
drink
first
coffee.
Yeah. What?
And drink coffee.
Drink coffee. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm Jose de Silva. And I have a question of this strangeness and sustainability that are, I think, related. Because the strangeness has a lot to do, I think, with the need and the want. Because if you go to a place that you want to go and build it and help build it. And so you sort of more easily adapt. And the need is that you are there because some reasons, maybe it's economical, maybe it's political, and then you are like in a shock or something that you are very much difficult. You have much more difficulty to adapt. And well, in a sustainable environment, you need a little bit of everything in order to make this chain of things that make sustainability work. And I guess the question is, how do you help the shift from the need to the want, so everybody becomes the people that you want to have in the new society or environment?
So you mean that some people are wanted in the municipality, but not necessarily they don't need to be there? But
No. That in the society, in the city, the people that you want to come to the city, you develop the things to have this trickle-down effect and all that. But you have also the people you mentioned, the immigrants that are here for economical or political reasons that can't adapt. So how do you shift so they want to be there and not they're only there?
Yeah, that's I remember I was in Karlstad University many years ago, and a bunch of my relatives had just come from Iraq. And I remember the principal, she said to me that, well, we want creative people to Karlstad, so you are welcome to move here anytime you want. So I thought, well, I have so many relatives who just came to Sweden. Maybe they can come here instead and live here. And obviously that's, there is an idea that we want strangers because strangers develop the city, but some strangers are better than other strangers, and there are obviously some strangers that we prefer to see there. And I always think it's so dangerous when we try to make strangers or try to legitimize or try to understand immigrants as something that is useful to the city. We saw that a lot in Välfärd för alla, that policy. It said very much that, well, immigrants, they have so much cultural specific knowledge that they come, with their culture, they have knowledge that we don't have here in Sweden. And they have so much experiences that we can capitalize on. And for me, I think that that's always a slippery slope, because then we also differ between the immigrants that are useful for us and the immigrants that are not useful for us. So I generally prefer not to do that at all, and not to try to argue for inclusiveness in terms of that people can contribute to the city. I prefer to argue for inclusiveness in terms of just equality or justice or all people's equal value. But there is definitely, I think, a movement towards that type of arguing. And we also see it within urban planning that, well, we can definitely, I think in Välfärd för alla, they describe it that we have these resources in the municipality that we haven't used, and that this is a shame for the city, that it is something that can contribute. And it sounds, nice, but I think that it is somewhat dangerous, and it can lead to a discourse on, useful and not useful immigrants and people. But I think that you touch upon a really important and delicate question here. I think it's a very good question.